It must have been tempting to remake Half-Life. That's what most sequels usually are, remakes. Especially in the world of first-person shooters, where stories are so interchangeable and mostly pointless. Most sequels take the old game, spiff it up a bit, stick in some new but fundamentally identical story, and call it a sequel. Most developers recycle their ideas, good and bad, when making a sequel, but imagine how tempting it must be to recycle a bona fide masterpiece. So, I'll say it again, it must have been very tempting to remake Half-Life. But Valve did not recycle Half-Life when making the sequel. Instead they chose to make a completely new game, a game unlike Half-Life, and indeed unlike any other first-person shooter out there. And the result is something magical. Half-Life 2 picks up a number of years after the original Half-Life. Courtesy of the mysterious G-Man, Freeman finds himself aboard a train inbound for City 17, one of the few remaining human cities after the invasion of a hostile alien force known as the Combine. Although the Combine is a new antagonist, their presence in the game is directly linked to the events of the original Half-Life. The return of Freeman, a man described in the game as messianic, sparks revolt amongst the oppressed human insurgents, culminating in a full-blown rebellion as Freeman progresses through City 17. Just like the original Half-Life, the story presented directly to the player is shallow, while the storytelling is quite wonderful. Much of the story is mere illusion, like, for example, the 7-hour war, which is given only the briefest of mentions, yet a very intricate web of events can be inferred by tying together little snippets of information, observed or casually overheard. This use of illusion and peripheral storytelling does of course mean some people may inadvertently miss out on the story aspects through their own lack of observational or deductive skills, meaning the quality of the experience hinges in no small part on the player. While this may cause the game to misrepresent itself on occasion, it's a great way to tell a story, as it makes the player as much an interpreter as an observer of that story. The original Half-Life was designed around the concept of diversity. The player would never do the same thing for too long, with combat sequences, platforming and puzzle sequences, and unique boss sequences and scripted events constantly providing the player with diverse experiences. Yet for all this diversity, each of Half-Life's areas was simply a variation on a theme. The gunplay was always fundamentally the same. The mechanics of platforming were always fundamentally the same. Between one firefight and the next, for example, you may do a number of different things, but those two firefights will be very similar and essentially interchangeable. And this is the issue Half-Life 2 has tackled. Half-Life 2 does not settle for mere variation on themes. With each new section, its entire focus shifts so completely that each new area is a computer game microcosm, yet all these areas fit together so coherently that Half-Life 2's world is utterly seamless. The opening area of the game presents the 1984-style dystopia where the oppressed inhabitants of the city struggle with despair, faced with frequent brutal attacks by the transhuman police force. It's not long before you're identified and suddenly you're running for your life, unarmed, from that police force. You then fall into a series of firefights as you equip yourself with weapons and have the opportunity to play with the physics in scripted sequences. Then, a lengthy hovercraft ride through City 17's waterways with frequent stops to solve the new physics-based puzzles and participate in occasional firefights eventually brings you to a rebel base where you get to meet new characters and experience some exposition. After some wonderful foreshadowing of the next area, Ravenholm, the gravity gun is introduced in a scene that is as delightful as it is unexpected. You're then thrust into Ravenholm, a town straight out of a classic horror movie where you get to mutilate headcrab zombies in all kinds of wonderful ways, courtesy of the gravity gun, and fight alongside the delightfully insane Father Grigori. After Ravenholm, you will find yourself speeding through sand dunes in a buggy, dodging giant insect-like creatures, and later participating in Half-Life 2's version of the film Tremors, where you have to create makeshift walkways across the sand. The rest I won't even mention, but it goes on level after level, each offering something new, and it suffices to say that each area is so unlike any other that Half-Life 2 almost feels like an amalgam of several smaller games. In other games, the locations change with each level, but each level plays in exactly the same way. With Half-Life 2, the game itself changes with each level. It's a degree of diversity that has never been seen in a first-person game, before or since, and it's that degree of diversity that makes Half-Life 2 the game it is. So much so, in fact, that I don't think of Half-Life 2 as a first-person shooter, but rather as a first-person adventure game. It's an idea that is met with unmitigated rejection. Half-Life 2 is, after all, a first-person game where you go around shooting people. But the combat in Half-Life 2 feels almost incidental to me, as if it's an unavoidable byproduct of the game's story. I feel the ever-shifting focus of the game is the game's defining characteristic. I do not think of Half-Life 2 as a first-person shooter at all. And that's just as well, because the vanilla gunplay is weak. The Combine Police Force in Half-Life 2 could be perceived as a bitter disappointment. The AI is paltry, with the most advanced move being to sidestep a little bit. Taken as a first-person shooter and judged on the merits of the gunplay, Half-Life 2 is not very good at all. The weapons are unsatisfying to use, the enemies are largely unsatisfying to fight. There's no sense of intensity in the combat. The vanilla combat is simply rote and stale. Half-Life 2's combat is at its finest when it's driven by the scenario. In Ravenholm, you're likely using the gravity gun to full effect, making use of the ample supply of circular saw blades and explosive canisters, while also making use of the incendiary and crushing traps set up by Father Grigori. During sand traps, you can use a giant industrial crane to crush Combine soldiers, while Nova Prospect is just awesome. Half-Life 2's vanilla combat is mediocre, but when the level's unique twist takes the combat in a totally new direction, it becomes amazing, though these areas may be few and far between. This means a fairly sizable element of Half-Life 2 is actually quite poor, and I think overall it's a game that people can be easily disappointed with, depending on how they choose to perceive the game. People expecting more of the original Half-Life, a game with magnificent gunplay, will surely be disappointed by Half-Life 2's clumsy AI and second-rate combat. But Half-Life 2 never intended to simply recycle Half-Life. Half-Life 2 is very much its own game with its own focus and style, and it's that makes Half-Life 2 such a great game, that it doesn't try to just be another version of its predecessor. How many sequels can actually say that? While it's not the first game to make use of realistic physics as a gameplay element, Half-Life 2 is deservedly the game recognised as bringing physics-based gameplay to the fore, at least in 3D games. Armed with the gravity gun, and before that his arms, Freeman can pick up, carry and throw objects that have realistic physical properties. This means puzzles like stacking boxes to climb up to a higher level or turning a seesaw into a ramp using heavy breeze blocks. These puzzles are amazing initially, but ultimately kind of gimmicky, and Valve wisely uses them sparingly throughout. When not stacking boxes, Freeman can throw stuff at enemies or fire them at lethal speeds with the gravity gun, turning almost anything into a makeshift weapon. This is very cool, but odds are you will stick to your shotter. As well as sort of pioneering the implementation of physics, another awesome technology which, at the time of writing in 2009, still hasn't been bested by any other developer is Valve's facial animation stuff. Going far beyond basic lip syncing, the entire face moves realistically through expressions, allowing the characters to emote realistically and give genuine performances far beyond those seen in other games. Whether it's the fawning looks of Alex Vance or the sly, knowing grins of her father Eli, these characters feel way more real than what has come before them. Judged against its predecessor, Half-Life 2 is disappointing. But to judge Half-Life 2 against its predecessor, or any other first-person game for that matter, is very unfair. They're too different to brook any kind of fair comparison. Half-Life 2 may be first-person and you may shoot people, but it has transcended the genre. One moment you're running through tenement buildings unarmed, the next you're creeping through a zombie town using a gravity gun to launch circular saw blades at zombies. The next you're commanding a swarm of giant insects in a prison raid. Whatever Half-Life 2 actually is, it's definitely the best at what it does.